I'm going to start, before I change to my first slide, give a little background on myself and the farming operation we run in southwestern Ontario. We've been growing and processing tomatoes for the last 50 years as a family. All our tomatoes have always been delivered to the plant in the local town, which we are on the very edge of, in Dresden, Ontario. We've been through in the 50 years probably 6 or 7 different ownership changes at that processing plant. We're currently owned by Conagra Foods, which is the Hunt's brands. My father and uncle started farming together in the late 60s, early 70s. My grandfather before that and his father before that, and I actually live in the home farm, and it's been in the Richards family for 118 years, I think my wife's research has shown. So we're rapidly, we've been established in the community for a number of years. Come from a family of 5 kids. I'm the oldest son. I have 2 younger brothers and 2 sisters who are twins who are younger yet. My uncle had 5 children also. They lost a daughter when she was 11 to a congenital heart disease. And his second oldest son, or his middle son, is farming with me currently in the operation that we run outside of Dresden. I wasn't going to come back to the farm. My wife says I tricked her into marrying me because I told her when I was graduating from high school that I wanted to be an engineer, and I was accepted to the University of Western Ontario in the engineering program. I don't know if it's the same in the States in the engineering program or what programs at college, but one of the major courses that's not on the schedule at University for Engineering at Western Ontario is how to drink beer. Sad to say, I excelled in that class and not so much in all the other ones that required a good mark to be able to come back. So I then went to what's now known as University of Guelph Ridgetown campus and did my diploma in horticultural production, and went to the University of Guelph main campus to continue my studies to try and get my Bachelor of Commerce. Due to some family issues and injuries at home, I ended up coming home early. We got a second tomato contract that my cousin and I farmed together for 4 or 5 years before the plant that we grow for in Dresden actually bought that processor, and we amalgamated operations and we run under one contract now. So when I came back to the farm, I was probably a little more progressive, I would say, and a little more willing to try some different things. And as some of you can appreciate, the push for using new technology can be daunting if you're the younger generation, and if it's always been done this way, that sometimes the introduction of a new system, particularly remembering that GPS and guidance and field record keeping real time was kind of a new thing back in the early to mid 90s. So I had to learn how to sell my ideas to my cousin, my uncle, and my father. And I'm going to go through the story of how we got to where we are today and what we're using today. So when I first came back to the farm, I recognized the potential to use the GPS technology as it came to light. When I took it, so I had to take the stance that we had to decide whether they were toys or tools, and that was kind of my father's saying, we need to decide whether it's just something to have, or are we going to be able to make use of it and put some money in the bank. So early on we had GPS guidance. This is all a history lesson for everybody that you've probably lived through. The GPS guidance early on was a light bar, and then they introduced assisted steering. Our first GPS system was a Cultiva 8, or not a Cultiva ATC, the Cultiva LTI, and I don't know if anybody remembers that. That was by Auto Farm. It was a black and white screen, and their big selling point was it gave you a virtual highway to follow when you were trying to steer. Some of the other things it was kind of clunky at doing, but you could get some real-time recording and documentation done, which I had identified when we got back to the farm. We needed to keep better track of what we were doing, when we were doing it, and what effect that had. Shortly after that, I believe Ag Leader came out with their yield mapping technology on the older combines, and we never did get it on the previous combines. But one of the things we did embrace immediately was site-specific soil sampling. We recognized that perhaps we could make some, or save some money when we were renting tomato ground, particularly by using variable rate prescription maps for soil, for fertilizer application. Tomato land rent in our area, this is back in the 90s, was running $400 to $500 an acre to rent the ground. And most of the time we had to dump about 1,000 pounds total of fertility onto the field to get a year's production out of it. We tried to enter into as many multi-year deals as we could where we would get the crop after tomatoes to be able to use up some of the residual fertility. But we also decided that using site-specific soil sampling on those farms and doing variable rate applications would probably save us some money, and in most cases it did. Keep in mind that when we looked for tomato ground, because tomatoes are a high-value crop, tomatoes at this point this year, I did my math on the way here, we have about $2,000 an acre invested in inputs in tomatoes. So it's a fairly substantial risk, and making sure you have appropriate land with appropriate fertility and particular pH was a very big concern then. So we did realize we realized quite a bit of savings when we did variable rate on those farms that we rented. We rent about 25% of the acreage that we need for tomatoes. Since the 90s, we've increased the amount of land that's as capable of growing tomatoes or good tomatoes. We've taken it into ownership. We've done, we call it upgrading land. We had a number of acres so where I live, we're right along the Sydenham River, and you'd have to look at a map. Where I live relative to the world, if everybody knows where Detroit is, if you go about 20 miles due east and 20 miles due north, you come into Dresden. You have to go around Lake St. Clair if you cross there. If anybody knows where Algonac, Michigan is, we're about 15 miles straight inland from where it crosses the river into the Walpole Island Indian Reserve. So the Sydenham River is kind of the break from we call it God's country on the south side of the river. It's Chatham Township. You can pretty much grow anything. The variety of crops going there, I couldn't even start to list it. I believe our ag advisor for the municipality had posted an article last year, and we grow over 80 different vegetable crops within the confines of the municipality of Chatham-Kent. But when you get to my side of the river, there's about a half a mile of really fertile ground, and then you run into some really nice clay loam, and then you run into stuff that would be similar to farming the parking lot outside. And we've had quite a bit of the parking lot ground. So as the opportunities arose, we've upgraded land by selling that and paying a little bit more to get some closer to the river, which we also use for irrigation. So as we continue to go through the toys or tools list, the other thing I identified early on, because I don't know how I ended up in that position, but from the beginning, I was the one that drove the sprayer 95% of the time, and I recognized the fact that swath control would be a very good addition using GPS and variable rate applications for some of the products we use in the tomatoes would be potentially a money-saving and yield-enhancing idea. So this is where we started. Like I said, we started actually one behind this, but we had the Cultiva ATCs. We ran 4 or 5 of those in machines. It was an aftermarket thing. We run pretty much all John Deere equipment. The Cultiva ATC, the first hydraulic auto steer we put on a tractor, ran through the Cultiva ATC and used the Outback e-drive system to drive it. A couple little scary moments, though, we discovered early on in guidance. If everybody has auto steer now, you know that as soon as you touch the steering wheel, it kicks it out, I think, on almost every brand. Not so much on the way they had this one set up. You had to actually physically push a button on the screen to shut it off, so we learned fairly quickly that doing fence rows, you didn't want to, doing beside the fence row wasn't an appropriate time to kick the auto steer in on the ATC. It may have required the repair of a couple of markers and some scary moments for the guy in the tractor seat. So what this provided for us was the visual guidance. We really found that visual guidance helped with fertilizer spreading, although Father and Uncle were pretty good at finding that 40-foot mark every time by themselves and getting it one end of the field to the other. We were mainly broadacre tillage, or we were all broadacre tillage at that point. Usually had the rows to follow from the year before. Dad loved spreading on plowed ground though, so sometimes his tracks would be on a bit of an angle, and this kind of straightened it out a little bit. I used it for spraying for quite a bit because it actually cost less than replacing my foam marker system if something broke. Still not the greatest for, how many people here remember driving to a light bar, or still do? I'm going to say that's like 30% of the crowd. Most of you probably started with some kind of assisted steering. The light bar was great, but staying on line, try it sometime. Use the light bar on top of your 2630 or 2600 or your Trimble 750 and try to drive straight to the other end and watch other stuff. It's not as easy as it sounds, but it was as good or better than foam markers. It was not, we determined, as easy as a marker for planting where you had that line to line up with and drive and see to the end of the field. Once you figured out to look when you got your line drove up and lined up, I always tell the guys I was trying to train, look about 4 miles or 2 miles ahead and find a stick or a hydro pole or electrical pole or a tree and drive towards it. But one day I went to the field after I had trained a young fellow to drive, and he had some really good straight passes, and the next pass he went probably 200 feet off to the side, and he had decided to line up with a semi-truck on the highway. And he drove right to it. Early on, also, the satellite array didn't seem to be quite as stable as it is now, and we suffered through many signal interruptions. And WASP back then was truly sub 12-inch because it would be out up to 12 inches even on pass to pass. So as we used the visual guidance, the question was, did it pay? Was it making us money or was it saving us money? And when we look back at that before we made the next step, which is on the next slide, a couple ways it paid. So I paid for the system in the sprayer by not upgrading my foam marker system and got along fine. It paid for when you used it for fertilizer spreading, if it wasn't one of the more experienced gentlemen driving the tractor, we had a more consistent spread pattern. Were we getting all our money back on it? No, but maybe we needed to take the next step. So the next step was, this is the Auto Farm Cultiva original mechanical drive unit. So if you notice, how many people used one of these? So for those of you who didn't, see this laser on? I'm going to go to that screen. See that lever right here? To engage the auto steer, you actually had to lift that lever up, slide it sideways, and lock it back down. Then it engaged the clutch. And noisy is an understatement for that motor when it was trying to steer, especially if you're in challenging conditions, because it would whack the steering wheel back and forth and the gears sounded like they were grinding. But when we put it in the sprayer and the fertilizer spreader tractor, it was a lot better to keep it straight. It was early times, in my opinion, and it actually worked, and they've refined that. I think a lot of you have seen like Raven, everybody's got an understeering wheel electric controller. The ATU for Deere is similar to that, much more refined. So it was probably the first iteration of that, and it did work. Not as well as hydraulic auto steer, but it did work. So when we realized that we could get the GPS to steer the system, we started to look at, so go back to me being the one that's pushing the technology. And I remember I got linked up with a salesman he specialized in precision equipment for one of the big dealers in Ontario. And we had a couple meetings, and we enjoyed each other's company and talking about what the possibilities were. But he said, Mark, when you start talking precision, it's kind of like an addictive drug. He said, I'm going to give you the visual guidance, and you're going to say, wow, this is great. And then when you get the mechanical drive unit, assisted steering, you're going to think, man, he said and the next thing you know, you're opening your wallet up and giving me all your money so you can get to the next step. Well, he was probably more than a little bit correct. So when we talk about exploring the possibilities, now that we know we can steer the thing and it can go straight, I was still rather naive and fairly young, and I had visions of running the whole farm on controlled traffic, and we'd have real-time data, and the record-keeping improvement would help us make better decisions, and we could look at making changes to how we did tillage. I talked yesterday in tomatoes, and I mentioned we were all broadacre tillage. I think most people were back in the mid to late 90s. There was some ridge till in our area, some strip cropping in our area, but the norm was a big tractor with a big cultivator, either a deep ripper or a moldboard plow. A bunch of passes, but I looked at, can we make changes to tillage with the GPS? And what would the long-term benefits be? And I started to list those off and try to sell those to my partners in the farming operation. But the biggest thing I was looking at was, how can we make this stuff work so we can be more efficient? And by more efficient, so what I started to look at was, I went to the field one day, and one of the hired men was driving the articulated tractor with the 30-foot or 32-foot cultivator behind. And I had to go fix something on the cultivator, and I was watching him come towards me, and man, he was overlapping by 2 feet. But he was straight, but he was overlapping by 2 feet. We had no guidance in this tractor. So I started doing the math, because when earlier I said we saw the biggest benefit, or the biggest payback, being use it in the sprayer, so it replaces a foam marker, and you use the sprayer a lot, you put a lot of product through it. But typically I think a decent sprayer operator with a foam marker with some experience can probably keep a 60-foot boom within a foot of where it's supposed to be. So your overlap's something like 1.8%, 2%, not quite 2%. When I saw that cultivator coming down and he was consistently lapping 2 feet on 30, I thought, we're going to make more money putting this stuff in tillage equipment than we are in any of the application equipment, because it's a narrower width and they tend to lap more. So we got thinking about it. I was selling the ideas, and trying to explore the possibilities, but then I had the reality check of talking to my father and uncle, who were less than embracive of they were less enthusiastic about embracing some of the technology. The main reason they were, I won't say naysayers, but entered into using more technology with trepidation, was due to some of the technical glitches. And I will admit, a lot of it on my part was not doing quite enough planning for how we were going to implement some of this stuff. So technical glitches, I want to talk a little bit about how you can avoid some of the technical glitches as you increase your reliance on technology or use it more. The fellow I told you I talked to about that thought I'd get addicted to precision and was clairvoyant because he was correct, told me I could get my equipment from him for about 15% off a list if I would be a sub-dealer for him. So basically I had to go and try and sell some of this stuff, but he didn't anticipate me selling a lot. It was just a way for me to get a nice little rebate to get us upgraded in precision equipment. But through that, I got to attend the dealer's sales training courses and talk to some of the other guys that were handling precision for him. This dealer in Ontario was kind of centrally located and didn't have any branches to the south or the east. And so once a year we got together in the summer for a 2-day thing. We went over sales training. But the most common thing that everybody said they got calls on, and we referred to it as the RTFM support call. Does anybody want to guess what RTFM stands for? It's read the friggin' manual. So I'm going to go, I know, and my wife tells me, and my father tells me I'm not the typical person. Before I even think about buying a piece of equipment, I'll go online and read the operator's manual one end to the other to make sure that what I'm looking at, I'm not expecting more than it's capable of, and that I have some understanding of what the complications and what the technicalities are using it. Fast forward to 2010, we bought a new John Deere 7030 series tractor with all the touch set controls. Well, Father's driven a tractor for 50 plus years, and he tells me, he's asking me how to do this and that on the tractor, and I had read the manual and told him how to get through it, and he says, well, how do you know all this? I said, well, I read the manual. Well, I bought tractors for 50 years, and I've never had to read the operator's manual on how to run one. Well, I'm here to tell you that with technology, and even with your new tractors, it's worth a little browse. Just got a new sprayer last week. Spent 5 or 6 hours going over that operator's manual, even though it was very similar to the one it replaced. But read the friggin' manual when you get a new piece of equipment, and one of the pieces of advice I'll give you is read it before you buy it. I always ask the salesman for a copy of the operator's manual. You don't have to read it like word for word, cover for cover, but make sure it's going to cover what you want to do. And that's getting back to the not enough planning. When you have expectations of something, the salesman's going to say, yeah, or we think we can do that. You want to make sure you understand what the limitations are before you spend $20,000 or $30,000 on an auto steer rate control system, I think. So as we went forward, I had to adapt my expectations of what we were going to get into. And I can't stress enough the long-term planning we had to embrace in order to make sure that what we wanted to do, what we thought we could do, and how we were going to do it fit with the long-term goals of the operation. The other thing was we didn't think we could make wholesale changes overnight. So that required some long-term planning, and then once we figured out a plan for where we wanted to be and how we were going to get there, we did it by steps. And I'm probably more enthusiastic about it than the rest of those on my operation, and it required me to acquire a rather large dose of patience. And at the end, I say reducing expectations, but it was more the title, adapting my expectations or making the expectations more realistic when you're trying to deal with other people that don't share your enthusiasm for it. So we had the one hydraulic auto steer system. We are in processing tomatoes. We noticed a problem in the tomatoes using the big tractor with triples on it. Tomato crop, we get a schedule from the processor that we have to plant by, and they usually want us to start earlier than we think we should start almost every year. And almost every year you run into that first week they want us to start and the land's not quite 100%. Well, for a high value crop, 100% fit land's one of the things you want to make sure you got. On the other hand, if you refuse to plant or don't keep up the schedule, you get, in processing tomato industry, we get a report card at the end of every year on how we fared to the rest of the growers. Processing tomato contracts they're not worth any money. It's not like quota in the dairy and feather industry in Canada, but it's not easy to get in. I said we've grown for 50 years. To be a new grower and apply to get a contract, I don't think our processor's taken a new grower on in 20 years, at least 20 years. Going over the list in my head, I'm sure it's been longer than that actually. So you want to do what you can to keep the processor happy, because you know if you lose that tomato contract because you're not performing up to their expectations. So it required us to push the ground a few years more than we wanted to. What we found though, doing broadacre tillage, so in tomatoes we started machine harvest in the mid-80s. I think it was 82, 83 we bought our first mechanical harvester for tomatoes. Up till that point we were all hand-picked. When we went to machine harvest, the system that they were using in California, I think they still do use in California, involved making raised beds. The reason they do it in California is for their flood irrigation. They have the channels for the water to flow down. It soaks into the beds where the tomatoes are and waters them. But all the harvesters were designed to run on those beds and harvest the tomatoes. We learned very rapidly that there was a big difference between some of the varieties of tomatoes they grew in California compared to our varieties, and that was shatter loss. By shatter loss, I mean, well, it's very similar to shatter loss on your combines. But figure a tomato, we had a variety that the joke was if you stood at the end of the field and sneezed, all the fruit would fall off the vine and roll into the trenches. I don't have a picture of tomato harvester, but picture we have a 6 or 5 foot wide bed. You have a head that's 5 feet wide, has knives on it that go under the ground to cut the vines off, and then you're trying to get all that stuff up in the machine. Now imagine tomatoes falling down in a trench that's 4 feet below the height of that chain. And we spent many hours of frustration in the shop, many days of frustration in the shop, figuring out how to push those tomatoes back up and get them into the head. As mechanical harvesting evolved, harvesters were designed. Actually, we use a brand that's made in Pennsylvania now to harvest tomatoes what we call on the flat, so we got rid of the beds. With the beds, though, back to why I mentioned that, we were completely controlled traffic, because in the fall we had a fall bedder that would do deep tillage and make the set of beds, so you never drove where the tomatoes were going to be planted. Think like strip-till. You never had a tire track where the tomatoes are going to be planted from the time you got out of there with the combine or the harvester the year before. And then you laid the field out so you could plant certain varieties in certain areas to do your break-ins or your breakouts for harvest in the fall. When we went to the flat, we thought, oh man, this is way better because we can just drive wherever with the big tractor, work the ground up. Well, like I said, we run in the spring on a farm that went from a sandy loam to a clay loam, and the person that worked it didn't realize that the ground that was clay loam wasn't really that fit, and we suffered through compaction issues through the crop that whole year, and we got thinking, how can we get back to controlled traffic? Well, to get back to controlled traffic, it was a perfect fit for the precision technology with the auto steer, so that's when we decided it wasn't strip-till that drove us to it, but it was controlled traffic in our tomato crop that drove us to getting to auto steer that was more accurate. The other crop that pushed us to more accuracy was sugar beets. We grow for the Michigan Sugar Co-op. Sugar beets for harvesting, it's a lot easier to harvest. Anybody that's harvested sugar beets when they're in a straight line, not when they have little curves. I know the row finder would help a little bit on the archway, but the straighter you were, the better, and we pushed towards to where we are now. So where we are now, and I'm not going to say it's the best brand. I'm not endorsing any brands. We were a 100% green farm for years, so we invested in the John Deere precision technology. Every one of our tractors that runs in any of the fields now has RTK on it. That's a significant investment, I'm sure you're aware. I say 70% the same brand. We're actually probably 90% now. We only have one machine that has an ag leader system with a mechanical drive unit on it, an old Miller sprayer we use for late side dressing corn. The other thing we gained when we went to the one brand is we have better data management. To make money off precision, I think that you have to have good data management, and that comes in your planning. And the planning, when you're RTK and auto steer and strip till and controlled traffic, includes a fair chunk of time in the winter making sure that you have all the fields named properly, you have the lines so everybody understands which one they're supposed to use when they're where in the field. So more attention to the planning, and to be honest, when we got to the John Deere stuff, it just worked. When you got in, you hit the auto steer button, it steered fairly straight right off the hop. There wasn't going in and changing or fine-tuning very many settings. So that got greater buy-in, especially from the older generation in our operation, because it was really easy to use as long as you could talk them through how to run the screens. Which, talk about reduced expectations and increased expectations. My father does not hesitate to call me, regardless of what I'm doing, if he's in the tractor, even though, father's semi-retired, so he only drives, he only runs a tomato planter in the spring, spreads some fertilizer, plays with an excavator and a backhoe. But he'll help us out in the field, so he wants to spread fertilizer. Well, I've taught him like 3 or 4 or 10 dozen times how to do the auto steer. But he fully expects me when he calls me, it doesn't matter what I'm doing or where I'm at, to be able to visualize and tell him exactly where the button is on the screen to push to get to where he wants to go. So I've reduced my expectations, but he's actually increased his expectations of me, because I have to have eidetic memory to remember where all this stuff is. Luckily, I use this stuff enough and I'm familiar enough I can usually get them through, but that's just an aside. So we got greater buy-in, and we're moving. We haven't got to strip-till yet. What has it allowed us to do? So we started to use, we've always used cover crops in the tomato crop. We started with spot cover crops on the erodible sand. We needed some organic material to hold it down. We wanted to help some fertility and some soil health. But I was very interested in what would happen if we spread cover crop over the whole field early on. We don't need that. The low ground will just make a mess. We'll have trash to deal with in the spring, and you can't plant tomatoes through that kind of trash. And to be honest, a tomato planter cannot handle very much trash. It's got a very blunt, deep shoe that has to drag through the ground. It doesn't have a V opener, and it does plug up with trash, but we do a lot of tillage to get rid of that, or we did a lot of tillage to get rid of that. Well, the cover crop thing ahead of tomatoes, we could see a difference probably the second year into it, where we were getting a more consistent plant stand and plant yield through all the dips and hollows, and broadcasting all over the place. And we figured out how to work it in, and termination timing, we've been around that for 20 years. You got to terminate it early enough that it'll go through the cultivator, because if you don't, you got a mess, and you can't get tomato plants to get in the ground sealed and properly. But we've actually expanded the cover crop, and this is through the use of precision. Without the auto steer on the corn and beet planter, we wouldn't have the nerve to try this. This is our very expensive, highly sophisticated corn interseeding side dressing rig. That was all sarcasm. I bought this at an auction sale for $1,000. I have more money into the new tires we had to put on it to put it in the field. But anyway, it's a 520 John Deere drill. You can get into corn almost up to my mid-thigh. Just wait until it's warm and make sure you hadn't used dicamba on it, and it won't break off. We try to get in a little bit earlier. We don't want to be too early because we don't want too much cover up before the corn shades it out. So we consider, this is a fairly economical approach. As I say, I spent more on the sprayer, the application system and the tires than I did on the whole machine. We started using our yield maps, combining them with satellite and drone imagery to determine whether we need to use different practices there. The yield maps have pretty much indicated that we've got our fertility in the proper spots. We have not started with the prescription seeding yet. We are doing the most work we do with variable rate was with lime application, because it is expensive, and we have some farms that need up to 3 tons an acre in spots and less than a ton in other spots. So the variable rate pays off there. Currently, we're using a satellite imagery. I'm part of a project with the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs in Ontario and the Ridgetown campus of the University of Guelph. It's called the Precision Farming. I can't remember what they named it completely, but what they're doing, well, I'll have to go back to why I got interested in it. So I'm obviously one of the bleeding edge guys, so about 7-8 years ago, one of the suppliers talked me into having my fields flown by the airplane and getting NDVI imagery. And I make the joke, he brings them in the office and here's the NDVI imagery from July and here's the yield map, and they're almost the same. I said, well, I don't want it to be the same. If there's a problem we can identify, how do we make it so the yield map's different, like better? So the one year they flew my sugarbeet fields, and I happened to have a tomato field in the scope of where the plane took the pictures. And I remember very clearly the whole situation, because it involved me coming home from a vacation, and I had to jump in a sprayer at 7 o'clock at night and spray this tomato field. Later that week I had a scouting report from my field scout that said there's some bacterial disease coming up in the tomatoes, nothing to be too alarmed about, continue your 7-day spray schedule. Well, later that week he sent me the imagery, and it was actually taken 7 days before I was in there with the sprayer and before I had the field report that said we had some bacterial infection in the tomatoes. Bacterial infection in the tomatoes isn't easy to fix. There's no bactericides that work. Fungicides work really good at keeping blights and alternary and all that stuff out, but there's nothing really to help with the bacterial diseases once they're established. So I got the drone imagery, and it was of the sugarbeet field, which was across the road from this tomato field, and I got about 2/3 of the tomato field in the picture. And I know they use a different algorithm to generate the NDVI based on crop, so it was using the sugarbeet algorithm, but it still showed in the tomato field these great big red areas. And there was a pattern, it was kind of a funny pattern. Well, lo and behold, 2 weeks later, the tomato field, that's exactly where the bacterial disease was the worst in the tomato field. So that was an aha moment. I said, we knew from the NDVI imagery 4 weeks before we saw how devastating it was there something we could do back then to do it? Well, the only solution they gave us for bacterial disease at that point was added nutrition. Well, when you got tomatoes that are canopied in and filling all the rows in, you can't really go through without doing some mechanical damage, which introduces more incidents of fungal diseases. So we looked at changing our whole system to get more nutrients to the tomatoes at the right time to fight bacterial disease. But anyway, that aha moment led me to believe, well, if we can get images of the tomato fields and we can find those red spots, we're not going to be able to, I recognized we won't be able to tell exactly what it was at that point in time, just from the imagery, but it would be really neat if we could figure out a variety of things you could do or ways you could address it. So the project with the University of Guelph and Omafra is we go out and mark the field areas I know from farming the farm that I know have different variabilities in them. Then we fly it with the drone at least 4 times during the season, or this year we're using satellite imagery through Farm Command. And they do tissue analysis, soil samples every 2 weeks from those spots, and if we see a red spot, they'll actually move and do some samples there. We're in year 2. Last year was a very variable field. Identified pH. I mentioned pH is very particular in tomatoes and sugar beets. If you have anything less than a 6, you're not going to get production. They identified some pH issues. We found root lesion nematodes in the tomatoes this year that we had no idea would be there. We're hoping to learn a little bit more, but at the very least now, when my scout goes out, he has a map. You can send him a KMZ file, which is a Google Earth file for those of you who aren't familiar with the dots after the files. And he can load it on his iPad, and it actually has his blue dot where he's walking relative to where the different colors are. And so what I call that is more targeted scouting, because I know scouts use a different pattern every time they're in the field, but this way they could still miss one of these red spots for 3 weeks at a time, depending on how they're patterned. Now we have more targeted scouting. If we see a problem from the imagery, either be satellite or drone imagery, we can have them specifically investigate that issue and see if we can find something to address it. So the other efficiencies we're finding, so back to the bankable benefits, we're more liberal at combining operations. So I mentioned the reason I had the interseeder in the background on this picture is because we decided we were going to side dress the 28 at the same time, so we weren't making a separate pass to interseed, because I'm still not sold that interseeding in the corn is the be-all and end-all. It established a good cover crop. We did 90 acres total last year out of 1,000 acres of corn. Did 5 test strips. Of the 5 test strips, 3 were actually, wasn't statistically significant, but they were actually 2 to 4 bushels better than the rest of the field. 2 were about the same as the rest of the field. So we figured we're not hurting ourselves, so we actually interseeded over half the acres of corn this year with a annual ryegrass crimson clover mix, and we'll see how that works out. I did learn this spring, and it's going to depend on the weather now because the combine will tell the tale, but the beans didn't look as good where we planted through the ryegrass residue, but I'd let it get too big. We got delayed spraying. I think I can address that by spraying earlier. So as we go through, so we did the 500 acres with this year. We're doing test strips of fungicide on corn and applying insecticide where we find western bean cutworm egg masses. Probably a total of 12 different trials this year between what University of Guelph's doing, what we're doing, and what OMAFRA's doing on our different farms. We're also participating in no phosphorus. We're in the Lake Erie, the Western Lake Erie watershed, where we get blamed for that ugly algal bloom on a regular basis. So we're looking at how we handle our phosphorus applications. We've never liked to put phosphorus out in the fall. We always want to put it out in the spring, close to when the crop can take it up. And we've changed how we apply the phosphorus. With strip-till, we apply all our phosphorus in the strip in the spring with the strip-tiller. Prior to that, we were putting the majority of our phosphorus on with the planter on a 2x2. We did, I think, 30 different strip trials over 2 years to determine whether we were hurting ourselves going away from a 2x2 to blending it all in the strip, and the results came back that there was no difference between the 2x2 and blending all that starter fertilizer in that 8-inch band. Maybe you could get, we're not seeing a difference in either the sugar beets or the corn that way, so I'm going to call it conclusive on our operation. The other thing we're able to use, so with the RTK steering, we have a 30-foot 1860 John Deere air seeder. I was able to seed maybe, I guess the pictures are big enough up there, but the top picture's looking down, and if you look closely, you can see little divots. Well, that's the row pattern of the tomato. Our tomatoes are 60-inch centers with rows 22 inches apart off center. So you have a 22-inch row, a 38-inch row, 22-inch spacing. Anyway, it works out on a 7.5-foot spacing drill that you can block off the right runs and be within 1/8 of an inch of dead-on center to have 15-inch gaps in the cover crop. The reason we don't want cover crop where we're going to plant the tomatoes is twofold. One, we can go through a cover crop that's as big as it is in those pictures with a strip tiller and never plug in the fall when it's green. And two, when we come back in the spring, we don't have any trash where the planter shoes are going to run. And that really sped up and improved planter operations compared to what we were doing with broadacre tillage and cover crops. To make the most out of the strip till in our operation, we recognized early on that we had to approach it with what I call a systems approach. We got I'll call it three different classes of ground or 3 different qualities of ground that we farm. I mentioned the parking lot clay back in Don Township. We do not grow sugar beets back there because we could probably grow sugar beets. Getting them out of the field in the fall might be a different story. We actually did grow some back there and didn't harvest those beets until the 7th of December in 2006 because it had been too wet too long. So those farms, we just farmed corn, soybeans, and wheat in rotation. Once we get set up in the strip till rotation, when I say get set up with a strip till, we had some fields that maybe had been plowed or ripped and not worked level enough. And with strip till, we like to start with a flat level table because we're going to use basically controlled traffic and we want smooth operations for the field stuff. So the first year, we will go in after wheat. We won't underseed it to clover. We'll work up the wheat straw or wheat stubble, use the land leveler, get it leveled out, and then make our first set of strips in the fall to put our potash down. And then from then on, the plan is strip-till corn, no-till soybeans, no-till wheat, strip-till corn, and use a clover crop underneath the wheat. Cover crop underneath the wheat, and we're trying to get the interseeded cover crop in the corn, so we'll have something growing almost every day of every year, all the way through the rotation. Residues are an issue in tomatoes, but there can be an issue for planter performance if you want to go fast with the corn and sugar beet planter. Particularly when you're planting sugar beets, we plant 1.25 inches to 1.25 inches. I know some guys are as shallow as 3/4 of an inch. We still like to hit moisture, and the new varieties, I believe, have enough push to get through 9 years, 9 years out of 10. But with cover crops in that strip, doesn't matter what kind of row cleaner we use or how careful we are, the root masses still get in there and make it variable. So that drill will also, you can block off runs to do 30-inch row spacing, and we did 2/3 of the cover crop after tomatoes and wheat last year with that row spacing blocked off on the drill. I had some problems in the one field where the strip till operator used the wrong line, and stripped spring strips beside fall strips. The corn looks fine, but he was down to 3 miles an hour to get a good ride on the precision monitor. We're looking at making that space a little wider so we're not planting residue. So we're relying on the cover crop in between the rows. I know we've dug in the strip and found the roots from the clover and wheat right through that strip. So we don't think we're hurting our soil integrity or structure by getting rid of this cover crop in the rows. We're hoping to have the same results. In tomatoes this year was the first year we did strip tillage. A little history. So on the tomatoes, we went to the flat with the big outfits. Then we went to completely controlled traffic with the auto steer. So the way we were doing tomatoes up until this year, we had a fall pass with a deep till rig. It was we like building stuff in the shop, but we have a lot of unicorns out in the back lot. If anybody's interested, they are magical and mythical. We took an old 5,000 Henniker cultivator, took the gauge wheels and the coulter off, so we just had the shank, put the narrow knives on, and you could get it down to the 22-inch inter-row spacing, and that would suck itself down about a foot deep into the ground, and we did fall tillage that way through our cover crop. Side benefit of that was the cover crop was hardly even phased by that. The roots just kept growing right through that block. It acted like a paratill. It just lifted that whole block of soil. We were going to plant the tomatoes up and set it down, fractured. We did it when it was dry. It fractured it. Cover crop continued to grow. Good results with that. But in the spring, to get rid of the cover crop, we had we're only 15 feet wide to plant tomatoes, 6 rows. It was a minimum of 3 passes to get the trash worked in. So we always had rye or wheat that would grow right through until the spring. It took a minimum of 3 passes through that in the spring to get it ready for the planter to go through so he could plant. And even then we were still running over some of it with a cultipacker to get lumps broke down and to get enough fine soil that we were happy with how it was sealing around the tomato plant. So using the drilled cover crop with a skip row configuration, we managed to manage that residue where we're going to plant. We have good residue in between the rows. You can see that's all rye straw underneath the tomatoes. There's still a fair bit of dirt there. We do in-crop cultivation. But with a strip till, and this was a big, well, let's put it this way. You could probably tell I'm the one that pushed us towards strip till tomatoes, and I wasn't feeling the love in the fall when I was getting a strip tiller set up. And a lot of concerns were brought forth that I recognize are concerns. One of the things with strip till and having residue between the rows is when we're planting in early May, there's generally a time in May, usually before the full moon, where there's a pretty good chance of frost. Tomatoes can't handle any frost. They can't freeze at all. We plant little plugs that are about this tall. There's 288 of them in a 18 by 1 foot tray. So they're very small and fragile. What we found over the years, though, if you stop planting 2 days before it freezes and the plant actually gets somewhat established and it's got good soil coverage and planted nice, they'll usually 90% will survive. So the residue between the rows with the strip tiller was a concern that it would allow it to get colder, and I'm not going to go into any discussions about residue being warmer or cooler or the microclimate. I just figured out the early field we would use a shorter cover crop and terminate it earlier. The strips we made, if I go back to that picture, that was a tomato strip right after the strip tiller passed. That's the late field of tomatoes, which was planted like a month after that pass, and that rye was actually 5 feet tall when we planted. But that's the width and the quality of the strip, and the tomatoes are going right down the center of that strip. So there is enough dark dirt there, I thought, to give us protection from frost. We didn't have the misfortune of getting that tested this year, so everything grew good. But it's one of the things that everybody in the operation wants to make sure we're watching as we go into this. But with the strip till pass, without the stuff in between the rows, we went from that 3 passes with a 15-foot S-tine cultivator pulling a cultipacker, and we were banding our fertilizer at that point to 1 pass with the strip till rig, putting on 400 pounds of fertilizer, 60% of it banded beside the rows, 40% of it blended in the strip. Crop Scout, the scout that scouts our tomato field scouts about 1,000 acres of tomatoes every week for other growers as well. And he shoots from the hip. He doesn't give you any bullshit. And I asked him point blank last week, I said, I want your frank answer. Do we A, look any better than conventional tillage? B, look any worse? And C, did we hurt ourselves? The biggest thing he said he notices in our fields, and I think I mentioned it earlier, is the consistency of the tomato crop one end of the field to the other, despite the different soil conditions and soil types from one end to the other. He doesn't know how to explain that compared to conventional tillage. He suspects it's to do with how we applied our fertility. And with the strip-till unit, we're using Orthman units. With the parallel linkage, he suspects that some of the guys that see more variability over a sand knoll are getting too deep with their tillage, or variability in the low ground aren't as deep as they think they could be, and they don't realize it's affecting planter performance, whereas we're keeping a consistent depth one end of the field to the other with the parallel linkage on the row units despite what's going on between the rows. That's one thing we suspect is helping with the tomato stand. And the other thing is the banding of the fertilizer and putting it close. The other change we made in going back to that bacterial disease infection, all they could tell us that year to fix a bacterial disease was put more nitrogen on. And when the tomatoes are that big to put nitrogen on, we had to use dissolved urea if we were going to do it, and then you had to blend it, and you could only put on like 10 pounds an application, and it was going to be a nightmare. We didn't do any of that. We took a pretty big hit on yield. But the tomatoes, when they take off in late June, early July, that rapid growth is when the bacterial disease, if it has it, won't let the plant grow. So it took me 2 or 3 years to figure this out. We needed to change when we put our nitrogen on. So I went through the research and looked at when a tomato plant uses most of its nitrogen, because we were historically putting all our nitrogen on up front. Before we were 28%, it was all done with urea or ammonium nitrate blended with and broadcast. So we're using 28%. We took that Henniker cultivator that we'd used for fall tillage, and now we use a strip tiller. We put new units or newer units on the back of it. The Henniker 5000 had the fertilizer tube that mounted behind the shank and went out the wings. I don't know if anybody used the Henniker. But anyway, we got the nitrogen 28% this far from the tomato row on the inner row spacing and about double that far away from the row on the wide spacing. And we were able to apply that right before the plant took off and started to need a lot of ends. So we figured that it would help boost the growth of the plant at the right time to help it fight disease, bacterial disease particularly. Luckily this year there's very little to no bacterial disease in the tomato crop anywhere in Chatham-Kent, so we didn't get to test that theory yet, but we're very happy with the visual results of how well the tomatoes took off after we applied that. So back to what I would consider a bankable, and it depends what you call bankable. I think somebody said, the first question a lot of people ask are you getting the same yields as your neighbors are when you're strip tilling? I don't know. I think I don't know my neighbors well enough for them to tell me. I know my neighbors pretty good, and I know most of them won't tell me the truth when I ask them what their yields were. And I probably don't tell them the truth when I tell them what mine are either. So, and my argument is it's not about who has the biggest absolute yield. It's who has the fattest wallet at the end of the year, and I think my wallet's fairly well padded. The difference we've seen, so we switched to strip, so the precision technology allowed us to move to strip till. We've adopted it. We have a system in place now with the strip till tomatoes. We took processing peas out of our rotation because they insisted we work the ground, and they chose when to come in and harvest. And how much time do I have left, Jack? 2 minutes? Anyway, we got rid of the peas for a number of reasons, and now if we can figure out how to get the majority of the tomatoes harvested when it's dry and don't make big tracks in the field, we're hoping not to have to do any broadacre tillage after tomatoes and go to planting a wheat crop right after tomatoes where we can to help alleviate compaction. So with strip-till, we're a 2-pass system now. With broadacre tillage, we were minimum 3, in most cases a 5-pass system. Strip-till uses, by my estimation, looking at the track and fuel, about 40% less fuel per pass than the broadacre did. We're only working 30% of the ground. With the system we're trying to adopt, we're going to never till between the rows, whereas in broadacre we were taking that soil structure back down to powder every year. So I have in here 20% less fuel per pass. We'd never drive where we're going to plant, so you can cheat a little bit and get in when it's maybe not 100% fit. And we're starting to see a multi-year benefit where we've got the rotation on the parking lot clay to the point where we're going to approach the 3rd year on one of the fields with corn, and we are about 15% higher than that county's average for production on corn. So we're thinking that maybe we're doing, and I just use the overall county averages from crop insurance to compare mine to, since I don't trust my neighbors. And it seemed like with broadacre tillage, we were starting over again every year. So where are we going to go now? Always looking for ways to leverage the investment. We have, when you figure it out, 5, 6, 7 tractors with RTK, about 25,000 Canadian apiece. That's a fairly large investment. We want to figure out how to leverage that and build on our efficiencies. We'll continue to evaluate the different cultural practices, where cover crops fit, how they work. Spend more time and effort on our data evaluation. I've subscribed to a couple different software packages to help with that, to make better decisions. And overall, I just hope to reduce my tuition every year, and that's the tuition in the School of Hard Knocks, to which I usually contribute a couple $1,000s a year. And I'm done.